Right, good morning everyone. Welcome to our Zoom session for week 8. Clearly we're getting through the course and moving along at quite a rate, and I won't talk too much about this week's work. We'll just go through our usual sequence of addressing the 3 or 4 course priorities for the week, beginning with a review of the content, talking about assessment, looking at the links to assessment, and going to the forums and having a look at what your concerns are and hopefully answering a few more of those questions. So let's get going. So it's an impossible week, this one. When this course was designed, I mean, fitting in 2 strands of science into 1 unit of study is always going to be a challenge. At some levels, this does reflect the new directions of the Queensland College of Teachers, though, where they've increased the entry levels to teaching courses and the amount of science you have to do to get in now. You have to do twice as much as most of you would have experienced when you were initially joining up or signing up for a teaching course. So you have to do twice as much science now just to qualify to enter, and as a result they've kind of pulled back a little bit on the amount of actual science content they're teaching, and teaching much more around the curriculum frameworks. So that's why we finished up with Frankenstein's monster. So we are looking at chemical and physical sciences essentially in the 1 unit of study, whereas once upon a time, not so long ago, these used to be entire units of study in their own right. And then there was a unit on pedagogy, science pedagogy. So we've actually collapsed three semesters of study pretty much into 1.5. So let's have a look anyway. Having made that comment, you know just how broad the physical sciences are, and this week we talk about them being broken down largely into electricity and magnets, forces in motion, as well as light and sound. Now, our readings are 18, 19, 20 and 21 of Loxley. Now, that looks like a lot of reading. Some of the chapters are quite short, particularly 21 on sound. 20 on light is pretty short too. They talk about basic principles. Really, that's all we need to be working effectively with inquiry-based learning and in this subject. But they're the same readings for next week too. So essentially, if you haven't got around to doing them all, don't panic, because next week when we look at assessment in the physical sciences, we're applying the same readings. So we're going back and looking at some of those units. I've also put up a physical sciences quiz. Please have a go at it. It's really there just to remind you that when you get into teaching or looking at teaching some of these units, it's always a good place to go to bone up your own knowledge, so that when you get that question out of left field, you may not know the answer, but you certainly have a resource. For instance, like the primary connections one down below, the hyperlink to the science background resources, you simply have a resource that you can send students to. Or if you want someone to do some extension work, I mean, the physical sciences strongly connected to human endeavour. Science is a human endeavour. Look at all the great discoveries and inventions. Again, have that hyperlink up your sleeve. Any student that may finish a task, or any group that may get to a particular point in your inquiry process before any other groups, send them to the Smithsonian Institute. Get them to look up a particular person or a particular event or a particular period in time. So do that extension thing. Have those up your sleeve, and certainly be aware of them yourself when you're teaching a unit, particularly on circuitry and electricity and magnetism, because the little, the areas in there's a lot of grey areas, a lot of misconceptions, and it's pretty easy to get yourself tongue-tied and twisted. So it's always good to do a little bit of background before you teach. The key terms this week, we're talking about building our own science literacy, and that's a really key point. Hopefully you're all working away at doing that now. We're talking about assessment task number 2. We've shifted pretty much into a full-on focus on that. It's all about assessment task number 2. And you've got 2 ways of looking at assessment. We talk about assessment of, for and as learning, and we also talk about diagnostic, formative and summative. A little bit later in this session, we're going to go and look at some of the samples in the subject MOODLE, and I want to talk to you about some of the errors and some of the obvious faux pas that you can make with assessment task number 2 and how to avoid them. So, but really we're talking about building our science literacy. And I've got a little video here. I'm not sure whether
School. Michael, a graduate teacher, demonstrates his knowledge of the concepts, substance and structure of the science curriculum. He consolidates students' conceptual development through planning and conducting hands-on investigations, encouraging them to use appropriate scientific terminology and emphasising the skills of inquiry.
So we've got a cell, or a battery, and we're trying to work out ways that we can get Huey the helicopter to work, didn't we? Now, did we try paper?
Yes.
We did. And did it work?
No.
But tell me, when we first put the paper and we were thinking about paper, we used a special word. What were we saying? When we read a book for the first time, and we look at the front of the book and the title, what are we making about the book? What do we say? What are we trying to say about the book? Yeah, Hogan? We're making a prediction about what the book's going to be about, aren't we? So we made a prediction to see, will the battery make Huey work using paper to conduct electricity? Because we knew paper already wasn't shiny, didn't we? And we knew that it wasn't very pliable, but we could twist it in different shapes, but it wasn't going to hold that shape very well. So we made a prediction. And then when we put the paper onto the battery to Huey, did it work? Well, what were we doing at the time? What were we doing? We were looking at it. What's that very special word that we were saying? Bryce? Conduct. That is a fantastic answer. Yep. But what were we saying? What were we doing when we were looking at it? We were, Jack? Observing it. We're making an observation to see, was the battery, was the power moving from the battery through the paper to charge up Huey? Yes, Nicholas?
No, it wasn't, because paper can't conduct electricity.
That's excellent.
It can't reflect light, and it's pliable, but it can't stay straight.
Excellent. That's a great answer, Nicholas. Now, what was Nicholas just saying about? He was just telling us about it. What's that special word that we're using, Hogan? Yeah, we're observing what was happening in the experiment. But what's that special word, Jack, that we call it when we then talk? We're explaining it. What an excellent answer.
What teaching strategies do you use to consolidate students' understanding of complex concepts? In what ways do you encourage students to use the language appropriate to different curriculum areas? What value do you place on reinforcing the skills of inquiry?
Teacher who is working with a group of students on a primary connections unit and is engaging these students in a very, very dynamic way. And the reason why I put it, it's only 2 and a bit minutes long, but it's a great example of formative assessment. And everything about this teacher is, is really what you'd look for in your recommendation section of assessment task number 2. So the things he does, the way he uses language for this particular, they look like a year 2 or 3 group. He focuses on language, he builds science literacy, he's using dynamic questioning, and I want you to keep an eye out for this when you're looking at the video. He uses dynamic questioning techniques to push this, this learning sequence along, and he's engaging in fairly heavy formative assessment. He's using prompts, he's using fat questioning, thin questioning, he's using great reinforcement. He uses wait time exceptionally well. So when you're looking at your formative assessment tasks and you're making recommendations, get in there and have a look at some of the skills and micro skills this teacher's using, because that is excellent formative assessment. Now, it's just a shame, unfortunately, when I use Zoom, so I won't push that too much further, but I will put the video up, but it's really worth a look. Now, this week we've talked about electricity and magnets from the content side, and again, the messages begin from learner misconceptions, and that's something he does so well in that video. And he actually begins, he's talking about circuitry, and that's the reason why I thought it'd be an excellent example. And some of these misconceptions comes up. You can see he deals with them explicitly. The notion of clashing currents. Current gets used up, and some of the current is used up. 3 basic misconceptions. So currents leave from both ends of the batteries, hit the light where they clash and explode, and the light comes on. Nice imaginative model, okay, and very common amongst children. Current gets used up, it leaves from the top of the battery, gets sucked dry by the globe, and then, it basically fizzles out somewhere along the wire. And then, again, hence this is why batteries go flat. Okay, we can see the little circuit. And this one here, it leaves as fat energy. And slowly, by the time it gets partially used up, partially consumed. So we can see a couple of different misconceptions going on there. And in the video, the teacher actually addresses these beautifully. And this is one of the reasons why I'm putting it up there, of course, to arrive at the conclusion. And he's looking at paper as a conductor. Will paper actually make Huey the helicopter fly? Will it connect energy between the battery and the cell, and the machine in order to make it function, or the propellers turn? And have a close look at his video when you're looking at it, because he's got the literacy on his board. He's got the spoken literacy. He's got the word fill and the word gap. He's prompting with a whole range of linguistic cues. and meta-linguistic cues too. So he's working at a whole range of levels there. It's a great, really good example of how you can improve formative assessment, and some really good ideas. But we see here the transformation, or the transport model of energy, and the transportation model, where we have the cell, energy travels around as the little trucks, and they return to the depot, and they just keep going around and around and around. So Loxley talks this week about the importance of having models for kids, so that when they have a misconception, you can feed them a model that helps them build their knowledge. And again, this may be something you tackle in assessment task number 2. This teacher is sitting down and working with these students to help develop and consolidate their understanding of the transport model of flow, okay, energy flow. So it's a really good video to watch. I won't plug it too much more. I will just put it up on the MOODLE and let you have a look at it. I'll probably put it in the forums, I think, so that you can actually just view it and make any comments or observations to each other and yourselves. Magnet worksheets. Again, we talked about magnets and the invisible force fields. The great opportunity to make your links here between electricity and magnetism with Osted's discovery, of course, the electromagnetic fields. Have a close look at that. It's all about making links and pushing learners along. If you've got the Smithsonian Institute link up your sleeve, you can send them straight there and ask them a simple question. Who was Osted? What did he discover? Why was it so important? Can you find an example of his discovery today? Send students out there and let them go. We talked also about, Loxley talked about energy conversions. How a particular source of energy, a chemical energy, for instance, maybe a heat, gets transferred or converted into electricity. Electrical energy then gets converted into kinetic energy, into light, and into sound. And we can see here, the chemistry of food, if you like. Food gets also converted by our bodies into forms of energy. The whole aim here is to set up little knowledge chains, little concept maps, and you can see, the energy conversions module lending itself very, very well to concept mapping, mind mapping. Types of forces we talked about this week also. We've identified, or Loxley identifies in the literature, in his text at least, or their text, about 8 different kinds of forces. And that's probably adequate for you to actually be teaching primary science. Here we can see, just the interactions of forces. Not only do we talk about forces as being a motion stimulus, but we also talk about forces as being multi-actional, multi-directional. So when we look at a person, we can sort of see, there are at least 4 different aspects or 4 different forces working on them at any given point in time. We can do the same with the car. We can talk about push forces, pull forces. We've got reaction forces from, the car pushing against gravity, and we've got gravitational forces holding the car in place. So this is a really ripe, a really fun area of science. And in a way, it's a little bit of a shame that we're dealing with it in such a quick and functional way, because there's so much more you could do with it. But the fun for you is assessment task number 2, which is all about how you actually assess students' understandings of this, how you diagnose what they do know, how you structure what they don't know, and how you would tease it out of them formatively and measure it summatively. So that's really assessment task number 2. Chapter 20 goes on to light and properties, and there's 3 basic things: refraction, reflection, and just what we call light, or looking at light as an energy source. It's a wave. We know it's a wave. It travels away from its epicenter. It travels outwards. It can be dull. It can be dim. It can be bright. It can be astonishing. It can have amplitude and intensity. And really, the things we look at here is just red light, white light, no light. We look at different types of light. We look at the whole notion of refraction here, the little example in the middle, when we shine 3 torches. We've got, photosynthesis, we've got energy conversion. And down here over on the right-hand side, of course, we've got the 3 basic functions of light. Based in here, of course, there's a little bit of work on the human eye, and Loxley talks about as well. A little bit of the biological science. So there's quite a bit of overlap when we look at the physical sciences. Here we've got the biological connections, and we've also got that with the function and structure of the human eye. We get on to waves, and this is chapter 21, where Loxley talks about sound. It's a pretty short chapter, but there are really, really strong curriculum links here to mathematics and music. And there's some great units being done, for instance, on music, musical sciences, and the science of music. And so, some fabulous opportunities to get in there. But, the 2 primary distinctions we make here is transverse waves and longitudinal compression waves. And of course the transverse, of course, you know, we get the notion of the Mexican wave. And the longitudinal compression waves, dominoes falling. You know, the whole notion that sound waves travel in the same direction as the particles which they're supporting. And, you know, again, Loxley comes up with a model here. You know, give students a model by which they can actually understand and relate, because that way you're going to deal with so many more of their misconceptions. Now, we could talk forever about the content of this particular week's course. That's just a 10-minute overview of the basic principles that you need to take away in order to teach primary school science. If you've got those comfortably in a framework where you can talk about them, you can understand them, then you're in a position where you can, you know, pretty much develop a teaching unit around it and diagnose the gaps in your learners' knowledge frameworks. What I really want to get on and talk about in some details is the links to assessment task number 2. Now, it's really important there. Up on the MOODLE page, the previous lecturer had put these examples. Now, I'm not a great believer in the examples, using examples as modelling as a way of teaching, because it can be taken the wrong way by learners. For instance, you can model a response and they can think it's the only response, it's the only way to go, or it is the best way to go, or it's the recommended way to go. In fact, none of the samples on that page would score above a credit. So please do not model your response on them. They cover the grounds, they pass the basics, they meet the assessment tasks, but they certainly don't excel at that assessment task. You know, if we look at the marking criteria, we can see that those tasks could go into a hell of a lot more detail than they have. And they could address those criteria much more explicitly than they have. And I'll talk about why. Anybody got any questions at this point?
When I look at examples on MOODLE, I often use them just as a starting point for, like, okay, what can I use to start structuring? Because I've got my own ideas, but sometimes you just need an idea on what sort of structure you might want to do. You know, I use it just mainly as an ideas.
Yeah, and that's sensible, Lauren. Not everyone is like that, though. I've actually got on to the MOODLE yesterday, and I'm going through the background reports, looking at user patterns. And user patterns tend to peak a little bit around about assessment time. And one of the areas where they peak most is people looking at these samples. And so I really want to go on record as saying to them, do not rely on these samples. If you do, you are limiting your potential with this task, because at best they would all score, you know, I think one of them probably, when we did our moderation, the team put it at a high credit. All the rest were low credits, the other two. So be cautious. You know, they're there to stimulate your critique, not to get people to, you know, as you say, Lauren, you know, not to get people to actually copy it, but to actually use it as a launching pad or a springboard.
I just have a question, Colin. If we make a recommendation, say if I wanted to, the primary connections don't have a great marking guide, would I say that they need a better marking guide, would I provide that example of what it should look like in an appendix?
Why not? I mean, you know, obviously you're talking about perhaps developing a rubric.
Yes, an
yeah.
8E, because primary connections are just above, below, at, expected, but it doesn't really give you enough detail.
Yeah, I would agree with you totally. Yeah. And I think developing your own rubric there as an indication of what you would do is a fabulous step, because if you look at these 3 samples here, and we'll look briefly at 1 or 2 of them in a moment, there's a lot of pointing. They point to things and say, this could be done or that could be done. But if you actually develop a rubric and say, okay, this task is lacking in you know, the learners don't actually fully get the opportunity to understand what the achievement levels are. So this rubric is going to unpack that for them. It's going to scaffold it into, you know, achievement levels and behaviours.
Yeah, well, I think in like the primary connection, it's very not clear. If I was teaching it, I think students would really not understand what they're being assessed on either. Like if you're just going through the lessons, they're not getting a good understanding of, oh, this is for my assessment.
Absolutely. And look, when you're using the rubric too, Sarah, you're opening the door to peer assessment too.
Yes, well, I was going to, in the first part, like the first unit, I thought to introduce them to self-assessment and then to build on that in the next unit, maybe use peer assessment.
Yeah, I find that really exciting. You know, I mean, that is making a real impact. These are good units. They're well organised in the content. You know, let's face it, we're talking about a science curriculum. So it's still, even though we talk about inquiry-based learning, it's still very heavily content-driven, as you can see. Now what we need to do as teachers is take that fine pedagogical lens to it and break it down with the sorts of suggestions that you're making here. You know, this unit could be better done if students took more control over their learning, knew what they had to produce by way of assessment, and could actually not only self-assess, but perhaps in the second unit, move into peer assessment where they're fine-tuning and honing those skills again. Yeah, I mean, that's really exciting stuff, you know, and go for it. It's a great direction to go in. And
yeah, that's good.
I feel like there's going to be a lot of justifying in this assessment. So any recommendations we have to justify in a lot of detail, I reckon. So any sort of chance we can get to show why this would work is just added to our appendix. Like, you know, say if I recommended a different activity, I should provide another one.
The justification is important, and look, I agree with you, Lauren. I would be spending the bulk of my assignment on the justification.
Okay.
So it's pretty easy, I think, to get in here and look at the unit and produce a table which breaks down the assessment into steps taken within the units. Here are the assessable moments, and you know, there's the diagnostic phase where the teacher's assessing understanding. Then there's the formative stage where the teacher's assessing their teaching of the misunderstanding or the misconceptions. And then there's a summative stage where, you know, that the students are being let loose in an investigation to demonstrate their science and inquiry skills. And they're also being let loose to demonstrate their, you know, the elaboration of their knowledge content, their Bloom stuff, into other areas or other applications. So definitely, and you are going to focus on those 3 assessment items: diagnostic, formative, summative, and you will be justifying your recommendations. Now, clearly, these are adequate units. So, you know, we're not going to bag them. We're not going to, you know, what we're going to say, point to gaps, you know, learner gaps, you know, information strategies, teaching strategies that are going to empower learners and help develop learner understandings. Let's look at a couple of examples. Sample task number 1, for instance. And when we look at this one, you can see that there's a lot of text in this one, a lot of referencing, and sometimes where it's going is not actually clear. In your introduction, just come out and say what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. Okay, it's really important to come out. Don't worry about justifying too much theoretically. You can do that later in your paper when you're actually talking about your recommendations. So here you're really instructing, you're writing directly in your introduction here, you're writing to your marker. Now, when this student did this one, of course, as you can see, they've used a biology unit. That's not possible this year. One of the feedback recommendations from the course last year was that, you know, we need to focus, it is chemical and physical sciences. So, all right, assessment task number 1, we opened the door and allowed people to do a range because of where we were at in the course in terms of time and content. But by this stage, we really should be focusing and fine-tuning our efforts on the physical and chemical sciences. So this is not an option for you this year to use the biological sciences or the earth and space. So it definitely must be coming from the 2 strands or substrands we're looking at. This student has tried to do some creative things here. But look, I question whether it's really worked. For instance, the reason for, nowhere have they actually explained this, what this column stands for, the reason column. Now, obviously we can imply, oh, this is, you know, for learning, assessment for learning, for and as learning. You can imply, but again, if you're going to do something like this, tell us in your introduction, you know, I present the unit and break it down into assessment moves or assessment steps as assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning.
Does it need to be in third person though? Like I thought we weren't supposed to say like you know, this assessment breaks down rah.
It entirely up to you how you write this paper. It does lend itself well, for instance, I think to third person, to academic style and format. It is kind of a report. And that's it's one thing I want to talk about here. As you can see, this person's doing it as a polemic essay with an introduction, body and conclusion. Now, I wonder whether that really works. I actually think you're probably going to need quite specific headings and, you know, and short paragraphs and every paragraph should be tailored to a point you're trying to make, because this student, as you see, has thrown all this stuff in here, and there's some good stuff in there, but they're just not getting credit for it because they're not sequencing it, or they're not elevating anything, a key point above anything else. But they are addressing the criteria: understanding, engagement, motivation. So they're the three things that you have to look at, and they are doing that. But again, they're not pointing to any examples. They're not pointing to any explanations of how this is done. It's really just, here we have a global term: engagement is evidenced through meaningful processing and relating new information. Yeah, okay, that's a quote from a textbook. But how do you, as a pre-service teacher, see that happening here? And that's the key. These are very global statements, and avoid this if you can, because students demonstrating knowledge, but the knowledge is not being applied to the curriculum units. And that was the whole goal here. We get down here, here's the second unit. Same thing again, same process. Generally good information, but all decontextualized. We've got Howell in here, we've got Walker, we've got Gregson. We don't really want to know about Howell, Walker and Gregson. What we want to know is the connections in this unit of study. Not how it's connected globally, but how it's actually connected specifically to themes of understanding, engagement and motivation, and how you as a teacher are going to link that. So some good ideas, but not quite pulling them off. Recommendations, as you can see here, again, very generic. Now, it's really important when you're doing your recommendations here, loosely tacking formative assessment, narrows it down onto a particular lesson, okay, which is good, because then you can actually tune in and have a close look at the lesson as a marker as to what they're trying to imply. And again, some recommendations here on how it could be improved, but no examples. The use of the internet, for instance. If you're going to suggest the use of the internet, talk about how. Are you going to flip the classroom? Are you going to do a web quest? What is the learning function of the internet in this particular case?
What websites could you use?
Even if you wanted to put that in your appendices, yes, or even if you had room in the body of your paper, and there's no reason why you shouldn't. You've got 3,500 words. You can include down, the list of web resources that you think would actually lend to understanding in this particular case. And the summative assessment, now you can see the structure addresses, it addresses everything, but the comments, it will motivate students to show. You say, what will? You need to be specific. If you're making a recommendation, you're talking about something that happened in the unit. Okay, let's call it X. X was designed to achieve this. X will achieve this for some students, but not for all. My recommendation is to develop a rubric. A rubric will break down this assessment task at summative. It will identify the learning behaviours students need to achieve. It will give them standards of performance so they know where they stand in terms of they can either choose to perform to a high level or choose to perform to a low level, and they can also self-assess. And go for it. Use Sarah's great little example there of working on the assessment and bringing it from self-assessment through to peer. It's a great transition, and you can see the consecutive development of the skills there. So all in all, not a bad paper, not a bad paper. And suddenly down here we're throwing in YouTube videos. Why? Okay, it clearly highlights seawater and drinking water are mixtures. Well, all right, so what difference is it going to make to the actual understanding here? These are the sorts of movements and interpretive steps that you need to make. And all in all, a credit paper, reasonably well done. But you can see where it could have gone a lot further than it has. Sample task number 3. I'll just make a quick comment on that one. You can have a look at it here. Again, quite text heavy. We're starting off with theoretical descriptions of the purpose and role of assessment. And that can be done in one sentence. Now, you don't need to spend a whole lot of time and effort on that. Explaining your assessment steps is good. Please, if you're going to use diagnostic formative summative, stick to it all the way throughout the paper. In sample number 1, she uses assessment for, assessment of, and assessment as, and then steps into an analyzing using diagnostic formative and summative. A little bit confusing for a marker. Okay, so if you're going to use one model, you talk about learning, for, assessment for, as, and of, then stick with that throughout your paper and try not to mix it up too much. That's why I prefer diagnostic formative and summative, because that's really how the units are built. And the purpose of diagnostic assessment is assessment for learning. So it's, that's what it's for. So link them together clearly. So we can see here an evaluation, feather, fur, or fins. Again, it's a biological sciences unit, not possible. Diagnostic assessment. And again, this is quite a clumsy way of doing it. If you have a look at it, it's very text heavy and it's a little bit clear. Every point looks the same. We're not quite sure what we're trying to make here. It's very descriptive. So this could all have been put in a table and could have been done a lot more simply, okay, and a lot more clearly for the marker. Summative assessment, and what we're doing here, we just spent almost 3 pages of text identifying where the assessment takes place in a unit. It's a long-winded way to do it. You could do that much more quickly, much more in a much more punchy way, and then free yourself up to talk about your recommendations and how you would help to achieve the purposes of assessment by implementing certain recommendations. And that's done reasonably well here. Again, identifies the branching key and use of colour in the branching key, using interactive whiteboard. Why? Okay, we don't know why. Why would you do those things? Okay, and here, justification. We get a justification down here. Good. All students are intrinsically motivated by using ICT, Gregson. Okay, I would talk about the motivational capacity of ICTs, but again, it's a kind of a global statement. It's kind of hanging there. It's not really linked to anything in the unit. And this is the key. If you're going to make a justification, target your recommendation. Say what you're going to do, why you're going to do it, and how you're going to do it. And this doesn't achieve that, as you can see. As a marker, I can see she's on the ball. Absolutely, she's in the right ballpark. Okay, but it's not making the links. Okay, using technology improves the student understanding of the content learned. How so in this case? How would it do any better than the teacher's currently done or the unit currently prescribes? What would you do, or what steps should a teacher take to make that connection and make it work? Now you might think I'm being nitpicky, but basically the criteria are there to differentiate the responses. And while this is a good response, okay, it's a high credit, we can see that in fact the student could have tackled things and targeted the recommendations more specifically and said more about how.
So you would put the bulk of the text in the justification and use tables and other...
Yeah, break the unit down. I mean, the unit's already there. I mean, some of the units are 112 pages long. So what you've got to do is contract that down into 3 assessment steps: diagnostic, formative, summative. Once you've done that contraction and you've got that visually represented, how does it connect to understanding, to motivation, to our 3rd category there? Once you've identified those connections and you've done that in a tabular format, you're then ready to get stuck into your justifications.
Would you recommend a table, or can we use other mind mapping options? Absolutely.
The only reason I'm suggesting the table is because that seems to be a common choice for a lot of people in the course, as we can see from the past samples. So definitely you could do a concept map or a mind map, or,
Okay.
Absolutely. Now what we've got here is, you see, this is what we call, and as markers, it's an appeal to authority. When we look at this, the student's putting up a justification, but in the justification, it's really just a whole lot of authors' names, and somehow that lends credibility in the student's mind to their suggestions, but they're still not saying how. Teaching and learning should equip learners with the ability to use and transfer their... Well, so how do you do that here? How does your recommendation do that? And here is a really good justification. She's got probably close to 10 justifications as to why this recommendation will add value, but there's no connection. Instead, there's an appeal to authority. On each case, have a look at it. Each one is authored and dated, and the authoritative source is there. That's not interpretation. Okay? That is an appeal to authority. It's just like saying, because mum said. Right? And we know what happens when children do that. Well, I'm sorry, mum didn't say that. What else did mum say? Go back. Get embedded in the content and the process of the paper, because it really goes beyond. It goes very much more beyond simply just saying, here is the assessment and it should do this, and Smith and Jones say so. You've then actually got to say, here's my recommendation, and here's where my recommendation does its work. Here's the trench in which my recommendation is going to float and bring learning to the surface. Yeah, sample 3, I just went through and did the mark again, and just thought I'd just share it with you. And when we look at the criteria, you know, it comes out around about a 33, 34. So it's a credit. And when we look at that, some of the reasons why, when we look at the criteria, there is a comprehensive explanation of formative and summative assessment, definitely. And there's explicit identification of the types of assessment used in the works, in each of the works. But there is a criteria above that which it doesn't touch. Have a close look and see whether you agree with that. Second criteria, there is substantial explanation of how the types of assessment used in the units of work demonstrate student understanding, motivate or engage students. The table does that quite well. And this demonstrates some understanding of the scientific concepts. Okay, more understanding could have been generated had the student have then gone to look at the recommendations and how those recommendations connect to science learning. Instead, all we got was a global reference to Gregson, or Smith and Jones, or Wolf, or Walker, all of these different texts who say it's a good thing to do. But again, it's one thing to know it's good, it's a totally other thing, total other level of understanding to be able to demonstrate it. And that's why I'm thinking, you know, if you're going to come up with a recommendation, make it as worked, make it as explicit as you possibly can for this assessment task. If you're talking about using a rubric, then think about developing one. It doesn't have to be perfect. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect. What it does, it has to explain your assessment step, your recommendation. That's all it has to do.
One of my first ever lecturers said, whenever you write an assignment with recommendations or any form of analysing, assume you're writing it for someone that has no experience in that subject area at all. So someone who is not a teacher, has no experience with science, could read it and completely understand it and implement it.
Yeah, a great point, Lauren. And so often in this subject, people begin writing their assignment as though we're all on the same page. You must bear in mind, academic writing is the art of seduction. Now, it's like walking into a bar and sitting down with someone at a stool and sort of chatting them up. You know, you've literally got to say, hey, this is why I'm here, this is what I'm going to do, and this is what we're going to drink. You know, and they can either agree or disagree or slap you and walk away at that point. But the message is you must do that in your academic papers too. You can't assume.
I don't think I've ever heard that analogy before, but I like it.
Yeah, do think about it, because, you know, you run the risk of alienating a marker right at the very outset of your paper. Assume, you know, and we'll get to the forums in a minute, you know, tell it to me like I'm a 6-year-old. It's a great strategy, you know, and that way everybody's on the same page, and any queries they have, will be legitimate queries, because it will be raised from a point where you're working together, you're in the same connective space. But if you don't do that work up the front of your paper and tell us what you're going to do, how you're going to tackle the paper in section 2 presents a table. In this table, we've listed the types of assessment, categorising them as diagnostic, formative and summative. We then, in the table, then links these to each of our science understandings, to motivation and engagement strategies. Having adopted and analysed the unit this way, section 3 of the paper then takes on the role of making recommendations as to how these units or aspects of these units can be improved. In particular, I have identified this, this and this in Unit 1, and I've identified this, this and this in Unit 2 as value-adding strategies for the teaching of this particular science unit. If you can do that for a learner, if you can do that for a reader, they're just going to sit back and say, well, take me away. I'm yours. Fantastic. Let's go. I can't wait. However, if you look at those 3 examples that we've just talked about, not one of them does it. Everybody talks from the authoritative position of a referenced text, an academic marker about assessment. Assessment is important, says Smith and Jones. Well, we know it is. That's why we're doing a 3,500 word assessment on it. In that first part, in your introduction, break it down. Tell us what you're going to tell us how you're going to tell us, and be as specific as you can. I'm going to look at this, this and this in Unit 1, and this, this, this in Unit 2. And do that up front in your introduction. Different way of tackling the task, isn't it? Criteria 3, substantial recommendations for identified. Yes, the student did this, but section 3 was worth 18 marks, okay, and have a look at what they're getting. So they're still down around the credit level, okay. They've identified 2 recommendations for 2 of the units, and identification of the types of assessment. There's some links to current research, okay, but mostly to academic. papers or textbooks. Outline of how report findings of students are presented. Okay, and this is generally not well done. It wasn't well done in assessment task number 1. You have standards, okay, achievement standards for each of these units. It's embedded in the Australian Curriculum of Science, and there are performance levels attached. Anything you do related to assessment must drag those performance levels back into your classroom. The teaching of those performances must be explicit. There must be learning behaviours that you are teaching when you're doing your teaching of science, okay, because you expect the students to demonstrate them, pick them up and run with them. So my point here is they're not terrible assignments, but if you are going to put so much work into this assignment and so much angst, then think about how someone who's reading it, think about what they're looking for, and think about how you can get your knowledge, your studentship across to a third person. Think about how it will come across. So I recommend a report format, an introduction, a very explicit introduction which tells us what you're going to tell us, how you're going to tell us, okay, and then tell us what you're going to tell us specifically. I'm going to look at this, this and this in Unit 1, this and this in Unit 2, and recommend value-adding changes to enhance the assessment at the diagnostic and formative stages in Unit 1 and at the formative and summative stages in Unit 2.
So Colin, we don't really need to go into too much depth in the intro about assessment, because I think I've used quite a lot of words already, because one of the criteria says about knowledge of formative and summative assessments, but can that be addressed then in our recommendations? Like if we're talking about
Absolutely, that's where they belong, isn't it? Because
yeah.
What's the point of putting that stuff up front? Because it's going to be support for your justifications, isn't it?
Yes, I just thought I'd just check that.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Sarah. And so many of those papers come out brandishing names, and reputations. Forget it. Just tell us what you're going to tell us.
Yeah.
In your recommendations, that's where you bring your friends out to play. That's where you put their names. That's where you enhance their concepts and you endorse their ideas. Connect it to your practice. Don't have it sitting there like an ashtray on a motorbike.
Yeah.
From the forums this week, people begin with, this is probably a stupid question. There is no such thing as a stupid question. Okay, let's get that straight. And this one's come up several times. But for the 2 consecutive units, can they be from the same science strand, both chemical or physical, or do they need to be from different strands? And look, the answer to that is they can be from the same or they can be from the different. But the notion of consecutive is yours to define. Now, if you go into the forum, have a look. There's some good questions there and some good responses around that. But really, consecutive can be related to science understandings. It can be related to science inquiry skills, which is a 2-year cycle, thematic cycle, or it can be related to science as a human endeavour, which is also a 2-year thematic scheme on which the curriculum is organised. You can pick them out. You are in charge. This is your furniture to toss around the room. Just don't break it. Put it in order. Rearrange the room the way you want it to be, and you're in charge of what consecutive actually means. The beauty of consecutive units is that one should build on the other. Okay, and I really want to remind you of that. That's in the forums too. There's a bit written about that. Don't simply repeat. As we can see, some of the samples there, there's a lot of repetition, and there's, for instance, 2 separate units. Very rarely is there reference from one unit to another. Like it's, okay, students are going to do this, now they've ticked those 2 things. Okay, over here in this unit, they're going to do this, they've ticked those 2 things. What about learner transference? What is going to transfer? What can you as a clever teacher teach in Unit 1, which you can now build on? And we heard Sarah talking about her ideas for assessment so beautifully. You can introduce something in Unit 1 and you can develop it in Unit 2. And the science inquiry skills can be a great organiser for that, which is really good. And so can human endeavour. You can look, for instance, chemical and physicals, and you could ethical dilemmas. What has this science meant for the world? The birth of the hydrogen bomb, for instance. Even Albert Einstein at the time wrote to the government and tried to stop it from using his ideas. Okay, so he could see where it was going. Second forum that's popping up regularly: are we required to provide justification of our units as consecutive for our assignment? Look, I think it makes sense to a reader. Just can't say, oh, look, I walked into a bar and I plucked these 2 units out of my pocket and therefore I'm doing my assessment this way. Or these 2 units fell out of the sky. No, if you can, just sort of say, science misconceptions. misconceptions around this particular theme, and hence I've selected these 2 units as a consecutive means to explore these misconceptions and apply diagnostic, formative and summative assessment strategies to help develop learner frameworks to provide alternate and more detailed and better solutions or resolutions and explanations. So have a look at that. You are required to do a justification, but don't labour it. Your reason is your reason. First of all, suggest they're consecutive and why they're consecutive, and then justify it. Okay, because they address a misconception. Okay, obviously, and that's all the justification you need to do. I read somewhere that we're able to choose just 2 science units, and they could be from different strands. Please, if you read that somewhere, unread it. You can't. They are actually chemical and physical science strands. So again, that's in the forum, and an explanation of why it's in the forum. It does exist. So we're not trying to be ridiculous. Tell it to me like I'm a 6-year-old. The notion of collaborations, trying to get you to work together, has been a real challenge. And I know you're busy people. The next post says, why and how. You're all very busy people, and you're doing distance mode study for very clear and obvious reasons. I get that. But it is still possible to collaborate, and you don't have to do it every day. But collaboration is collaborative learning, and this is embedded, the model is embedded in primary connections, but not collaborative assessing. All students are assessed on their own understanding. So please, if you are working with someone else and sharing units and developing ideas and unpacking tables and doing all those kinds of things, great. But please write your own assignment. Do not submit work that is collaborative in nature. The ideas can be collaborative. The formations, the analysis of the unit can be collaborative. But please, the recommendations are going to carry so much of your own ideas and your own thoughts and your own teaching strengths and philosophies. So they will be radically different. Don't submit the same essays, whatever you do, or the same assignments. They work together on them. Do the collaborative learning. But the assessment should reflect your own understandings and your own ambitions for this project. And the 5th one I picked out from the forums. There's quite a few there to choose from. And this is Adele, and it's a really, sort of beautiful acknowledgement of the work she's putting in and the thinking she's doing. And I've allocated 250 for my intro, obviously very word conscious after the first task and the notion of being, unfair advantage. So people have become very word conscious, which is great because, to be honest, in a school, in a classroom, in the education system, less words are better. I mean, one of the things we need to do is learn to express ourselves in a simple way with less words and less effort. 250 for my intro, good. 1,000 for each unit, chemistry and physical, and 1,000 for the justifications, recommendations, and then 250 for conclusion. Does this sound about right? Yeah, it sounds about right. Any comments on that from the group?
Well, I haven't actually started writing. I've just been getting my ideas, so I'm not sure at the moment.
Yeah, no. But look, it's like for me, it's like laying out a photo album, or a spread or any sort of design task you do. You lay it down, and then you have a look at what works. So, for instance, 1,000 for each unit. I'm looking and thinking might be a bit heavy. I'd rather see 1,500 on the justification and a much more descriptive breakdown of the units. Here is the unit on chemistry I'm doing. Here is the diagnostic, formative and assessment steps. Here is how they connect to understandings, engagement and motivation. Okay, and put that neatly in your paper. If you can, try and keep it to around about 750 words. Anything you can't, maybe that doesn't belong in there. Maybe it should be in your appendices. Think about that. And then try and create about 1,500 for your justification, because that's where your marks are. Okay, when you look at it and say, clearly this unit is adequate. Okay, it's popular, it's taught across Australia, it matches the criteria of the national curriculum, it ticks the boxes of collaborative learning and also the 5Es model of inquiry. So clearly there's a lot that's right about the unit. However, the recommendations I'm going to choose are going to add value here and here, and then get stuck into them and talk about why and where you got your ideas from and who are the people you're quoting here, who's your tribe, what tree do you sit in when you talk about this philosophy or this approach. Give yourself 1,500 words to do that if you want. And then a conclusion, just to tell us what you told us. So in your introduction, tell us what you're going to tell us how, and tell us what your specific recommendations are. 1,500 words then to do chemistry and physical units. Anything more than that, think about whether you need to put it in your appendices. For instance, you don't need to describe the units very much. Okay, formative assessment takes place at this particular lesson in this particular week. Briefly describe the task or mention the task, and then point to its connections to science understandings, to motivation, to engagement. Done. And then get stuck into your justification, because we know these units work. You know, I know it's 112 pages long and you're being asked to condense it down to 750 words. So it's a real critical skill there. And that's why we attach marks to it. And that's why we see it as an important step. So, you know, have a close look at that. But I would think 750 for each unit, if you can. You know, be pretty critical and insightful in your judgment, because the units exist. They do their work. They're well known, and they're well designed. They reflect certain principles, curriculum principles and pedagogical principles that are well known. The 5 E's, collaborative learning, inquiry-based learning. They're well organised. So you don't need to repeat that. What you do need is to get into the justification of the changes that you would make to it and why, because here is where you do your student work. Here is where you reflect what you know. Here is where you bring your tribe and you bring people up into your tree and you talk about why this is important from your teaching perspective. And then your conclusion, tell us what you told us. This paper has explored these 2 units, occur at this particular curriculum level. Common misconceptions around this include these. They've identified how this is addressed through diagnostic, formative and summative assessments and made the following recommendations. End of story. Nothing new in the conclusion. You know, no one's going to jump out from a wardrobe in a Batman suit and say, surprise. Okay, not in the conclusion. I should know what you're thinking and what you've done well before I get there. I should know that in your introduction, in fact. Any comments or questions there? Okay, I'll just keep going. I've done a table format for the units, great, and used the same layout as the description sheet column, had good. Under engaged motivation, I've used lesson examples of hands-on practice to keep the students motivated and engaged. Yes, good stuff. Any strategies or